The tagline for The Persistent is covering women for a change. I launched it in 2024 because women aren't terribly well covered in the news. They're not terribly well covered in the mainstream news. We tend to, and when I say we, I mean globally, news organizations tend to stereotype women's stories. They tend to put women as the victim. They tend to kind of serve up women's stories with a big dose of eye roll. There's always this assumption that nobody's interested in that. We covered this last year. We don't think we want to go there again. And there's just kind of this feeling that women's stories really don't have that much merit, that they're not serious, that they're not valuable, that they're kind of cute, that they sort of belong, you know, maybe they belong on page 9 or 10 after we've dealt with the serious stuff.
This is the Visible Voices podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Today, audience, on the program, I'm speaking with Francesca Donner. She is founder and CEO of The Persistent. This is a digital journalism platform putting women's voices and stories at the center, not the sidebar. Francesca's career spans 2 decades, rising through editing roles at GQ, Forbes, Quartz, The Wall Street Journal, and The New York Times, where she became gender editor and founded In Her Words, a vertical examining politics, economics, and culture through a gender lens. Now, in 2024, she stepped off the traditional media path to build something new. That's what we're going to hear about today. Francesca, welcome to the Visible Voices podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Resa.
Okay, I'm going to jump right into your voice. The name of the podcast is The Visible Voices. When did you realize you had a voice? When did you start using your voice? And just based on the brief description I've given to the audience of The Persistent, this is obviously a using your voice.
You really jumped right in there. And it's actually quite a complicated question for me to answer, but I'm going to do my best. The first thing I should probably tell you is that I'm really an editor. It's worth taking a moment to really talk about what an editor does and why an editor does their job. An editor is there to make the writer shine. And I often think that it is really the writer whose voice you notice, it's the writer whose work you read, and it is the editor who is quietly in the background deciding we need more of this or less of that, and we really want to focus on these stories, maybe a little bit less on those stories. And so to have a voice as an editor is quite a subtle thing because you often don't see my name in the bylines unless I'm forced to write. But my absolute instinct is to think about stories that I want to read, assign stories, get brilliant writers doing them, and then make those stories absolutely the best that I can make them along with the writer. And that's really a partnership.
So this voice as editor, when did you first realize you had it? Take us back.
I can probably point to moments along the trajectory where I sort of took a step back and said, oh my goodness, this is interesting. People are listening to me. Maybe they're taking me seriously, maybe they're not, but they are hearing me in some fashion. So I grew up in the UK. My parents are actually American, but I moved to the UK when I was very little. And I ended up going through the sort of quite traditional British school system and attended boarding school and things like that. And as a result, I have the voice that you are hearing right now, which some people would say, oh, you have an accent. But my response to that would be, everybody has an accent. I have the accent that I have. You have the accent that you have. We all have an accent, or an accent, as people might like to say. So I have this voice. After I graduated from high school in the UK with my A-levels, I crossed the pond, as we might say, and attended Brown, which we both attended. As it turns out, my voice there, my literal voice and my accent was quite unusual there. I don't want to suggest that there weren't lots and lots of international students, but we weren't the majority. And the British accent that you hear me talking with just now, which of course is a very specific slice of many British accents, right? But the voice you hear was unusual there. What I realized is that this voice that I have carries weight even when it might not be merited. I was sitting in an English class one day, and which I really loved. I loved all my English classes at Brown, and I took many of them. And I was sitting in English class, and I made some, 9 a.m. comment about whatever we were reading in the Northern Anthology or whatnot. It was not particularly profound. I'm sure it was fine. I'm sure it was average. It was probably a solid B, my comment. And someone came up to me after class, a fellow student, and she said, "Oh, Francesca, what you said was just magnificent." And I realized in that moment that there, of course, is so much conveyed through a voice, through an accent, through how we perceive people. In that moment, I was quite lucky to be bestowed with this slightly snotty sounding accent that made it sound like things that I was saying were perhaps cleverer than they were. That's a bit of a candid story. Do with it and make with it what you will. But that was a moment of realizing, in the very literal sense, wow, this is something interesting. Don't want to abuse that, right? So I think a lot about kind of discarding those things, those sort of shortcuts around accents and what we hear, and really trying to find the sort of message underneath that. So that's kind of the first part in a very literal sense. Later on, you generously walk through my career. I cannot say that I in any way rose the ranks at GQ magazine, where I was very firmly an editorial assistant. But I did spend the majority of my career, really the very vast majority, at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And it's not voice in the literal sense, but it's credibility, right? And so to be able to walk into a room and say, oh yes, well, I work for the Wall Street Journal, I work for the New York Times, no further explanation is needed. And there is such weight that brings when you can say that, when you are in that environment, when you're surrounded by people who are really truly magnificent at what they do, at the reporting they do, the journalism. And I think probably working in those specific places was really a moment of realizing I've got this voice in part because of where I am.
Thank you so much for those shares. And it really gives insight into the nuance of one's voice, literally and figuratively. The word that came to mind for me when you shared this story from English class is you came across as erudite. And I like that word, and I wanted to use that word.
10 points for the SAT word.
Thank you. Maybe Scrabble will get some points too. Reporting and journalism is not the same as editing. And before we pressed start, I talked about how someone could be a really, really good clinician, physician. And then because they're good and they've been there enough years, they get promoted to leadership. All of a sudden, they're managing people. All of a sudden, they're making department decisions, but they've had no training, no professional development. But it's just thought, well, that's, of course, the next promotion position that person seeks. You have been clear about saying that thread, reporter journalist to editor, doesn't make sense for everybody and isn't the right place for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're also sort of getting tangled up in the broader idea of who should be a manager and who shouldn't. Those are, management is such a very specific skill set. And I think to some extent it can be learned. I will say, speaking for myself, I've always kind of fallen into that role of managing, even when I was younger in my career. Some people have the skills to feel comfortable with managing and sort of guiding and shaping and lifting up. And some people, it's just not part of, how they're made. And I think we have to acknowledge that, because I think clearly in medicine, in journalism, and basically almost any industry one can think of, we sort of have this idea that the management trajectory is the upward trajectory. And that's kind of the goal that we all ultimately want to reach. Journalism, the examples are very specific, and you touched on them just now. But, people who are editors are very good at editing, shaping, cultivating, deciding, looking at the big picture. People who are reporters are very good at asking questions. Editors should also be good at asking questions, but reporters are good at asking questions and finding the story and needling through and being very tenacious. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, a good reporter, a great reporter, is not necessarily a great manager, right? And I think that a great writer is not necessarily a great manager. And I think one of the things I think about a lot in this is, we can break it down even further. A lot of the reporters and journalists that I've worked with, some of them are really excellent reporters, meaning they are fantastic at getting a story. They're fantastic at interviewing people, but they actually really fall down when it comes to writing. They're not necessarily great at conveying those ideas in a coherent way. Other people are fantastic writers that just sort of make everything sing, but they might not be that great on ideas, and they actually might not be such great reporters. And the magic comes, and it's actually quite rare, when you have someone who's both an amazing reporter and an amazing writer, and you put those two things together, and then you find stories that just sing.
I want to jump in here and talk about what you just shared about, someone could be a really good reporter and not necessarily a good writer, and vice versa. And there's a distinction, editing versus writing. I give a lot of lectures, a lot of talks, and I've worked with speaker coaches. And interestingly, speaker coaches can be really amazing at coaching, and they themselves may not be good speakers. And speakers that just always hit it out the park, rave reviews in terms of their delivery and their content, don't know how to coach other people. And I really think that this is a very similar nuance.
Yep. I totally agree with you. So I laugh and say, I'm not a good writer. I don't know how to write, but I definitely know how to help other people write. But the reality is, I don't sit down and write. I don't sit down and get all my thoughts out on paper. It's just sort of not inherent to who I am. But when somebody gives me a piece of text or a story that they've written, or anything that's on a page, I literally cannot help. And it's not in a bad way that I'm like constantly scanning you for errors or whatever. I just can't help taking it apart, putting it back together, maybe remove this, put this back in, da 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 da. But if someone needs guidance and support on that, I can't help delivering that. I just can't. And I think it's just inherent to sort of how I think. And
I love the compulsion. I want to jump into the persistent, but one question before we go deep. You worked at the Times, founder of the vertical In Her Words. For many people, they would think, well, that was the penultimate. Why the jump?
Well, firstly, I wasn't the only founder of In Her Words. It takes a village, and it was, as you can imagine, a big team, and there were many other people. At the time, I was working with a fantastic editor and writer who might be more of a writer than an editor named... The Times is a very complicated place because I think it is the sort of peak and pinnacle for so many people who want to be in journalism, think, yes, well, if I can just get a job at the Times, if I can just work at the Times, if I can just get a freelance piece published in the Times, then everything is done, all the boxes are checked, and it's finished, it's done, it's complete, hooray. And I think it can be very hard when you're working at the Times to actually imagine a life outside of it. Walking out of the Times felt it was sort of, the first question is sort of, oh my God, what about my identity, right? What do I get to say when I walk into a room, right? We talked about those sort of shortcuts of being able to say, yes, I work at the Journal, I work at the Times, and no more questions are needed, right? And so suddenly when you take that away, you have to sort of be your own advocate and kind of bolster your own story and start explaining, yes, but this is who I am, and this is why I have value, and this is why you should be listening to what I have to say. So I think that's part of it. But I also think something else happens, which I think is this sort of liberation of feeling like I'm not constrained. The Times is great, but it's also complicated. And when you work at the Times or the Journal or these other fabulous newspapers, you're very much under the microscope of sort of what you're doing and whether they did this and was this a mistake and should they have gone there and why didn't they do it this way and why aren't they covering this more? And, I get so much, even when I just post a story on LinkedIn from the Times or whatever, so much outrage, they're doing a terrible job on the Epstein files or whatever. And I'm thinking, actually, they're not doing a terrible job on the Epstein files. It's impossibly hard to cover. And the feeling of being a little bit unknown actually is quite exciting because then you don't bring that baggage with you as well. So, and I think it's quite liberating to just sort of be yourself and, this is who I am. I'm going to put myself out there. And, I've got a little bit of background to kind of give you some cues that, yes, I am a journalist. Yes, I know what I'm doing. But other than that, sort of, let's see where we go.
Yeah.
It's quite exciting.
I've worked in many emergency departments that are literally shaped like a fishbowl. So
Hmm.
everybody's
Hmm.
watching you.
Hmm.
So the persistent.
The tagline for the Persistent is covering women for a change. I launched it in 2024 because women aren't terribly well covered in the news. They're not terribly well covered in the mainstream news. We tend to, and when I say we, I mean globally, news organizations tend to stereotype women's stories. They tend to put women as the victim. They tend to kind of serve up women's stories with a big dose of eye roll. There's always this assumption that nobody's interested in that. We covered this last year. We don't think we want to go there again. And there's just kind of this feeling that women's stories really don't have that much merit, that they're not serious, that they're not valuable, that they're kind of cute, that they sort of belong, maybe they belong on page 9 or 10 after we've dealt with the serious stuff.
Right.
Which
The main
irritates me to
stories.
no end, right? Because I think women are, 50% of the population, right? Doing it more than 50%, doing an enormous amount of unpaid labor to prop up the global economy. If women weren't doing, care work and work for free, there would be no global economy. There are all sorts of issues that we sort of look at as sort of cute or quaint or tiresome. I mean, things like the gender pay gap, which really is pervasive. And it's still stuck around 80 cents on the dollar. And somehow that story is like, well, yeah, we've been there, seen that. What's new? And it's like, well, nothing's new, but nothing's changing. And I think that we've become so complacent as we think about women. People who say, oh, but things have gotten so much better. I mean, sure, okay, lots has gotten better, but we're still stuck at a Congress that's 25% women. That's not parity. We're still stuck in the most pathetic numbers for women CEOs for Fortune 500 companies, right? So we can sit here and say, oh yes, it's getting better, but the numbers, the data sort of tells the story for you. Men and women together. I mean, this is the way it should be, but women are so sidelined out constantly, and you see it in kind of the big stuff, the big, the data that I just referenced, or you see it in the small stuff of who's quietly toiling away, who's doing the unpaid labor, who's getting this call from the, from the school nurse, who's picking up the pieces when the kid gets sick. And it's so prevalent and pervasive. I mean, women do more unpaid labor than men in every single country in the world. Even the Scandinavian countries. Come on.
You have highlighted the percentage of men who are quoted for main stories as subject matter expert. It reminds me of what I see in medicine in terms of, number one, who's quoted, who's invited to give the keynote, who's the first author on the paper, and on and on and on and on. So
in journalism, one of the jobs that the reporter needs to do is find experts for the story. And usually the reporter's on kind of a tight turnaround and they've got to get the thing in. And so they're often sort of doing their best job to sort of use the shortcuts that they can. So they might kind of flick over and be like, oh, yes, looks like there was a really fantastic person quoted in the Washington Post, right? I'll borrow that guy. He sounds great. Perfect quote. The guy is really proficient, knows exactly what to do, speaks in sound bites, exactly what we want. The problem with that, of course, is that we end up kind of hearing the same voices over and over and over again.
Echo chamber.
And then those are the voices that kind of get picked up, and those are the voices that are requoted, and on it goes. And I think that what's quite interesting is, first of all, we don't notice it unless we have it pointed out. So one of the things that can be quite an interesting exercise if you're a journalist is to sort of look at your work and really start to break down, well, who did I quote and why did I quote them and what's going on there? And then the second thing is to say, once you've realized that you have probably met industry standard, which is quoting men about 75% of the time, then you can say, right, what can I do about that? And this is where it gets interesting, because what you can do about it is actually much easier than you think, which is, if I'm citing someone from an academic paper, there might be 2 or 3 or 4 names on it. Instead of just taking the lead name, maybe take the second name. Quoting a wide array of people is fantastic because it's the right thing to do, but it's also going to make your journalism better. It's going to make the journalism richer because we aren't just hearing always from one perspective, the same voice over and over. We're hearing from a multiplicity of perspectives.
The skeptics, the people that are kind of distrustful, how are you ensuring that this isn't a journal, a community, yes, for women, but just for white women? How are you ensuring that's not what is happening?
That's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it. And I think for the sake of your listeners, I'm a white woman. I'm middle-aged and proudly so. It's such an important question, right? So here's the thing. I can't change the lens through which I see the world or experience the world. I am who I am. So I am going to see the world in this way. But what I can do is I can create a space that is going to bring other voices to this table. And that means for me as an editor, it means seeking out writers who are going to bring that diversity of perspective to this platform. When I think about The Persistent, right, that our mission is to amplify women's voices. But I don't just want to amplify women's voices through my own personal Substack. That would be absolutely ridiculous. And so I think about it, I sort of take it a step further and I say, how do we amplify women's voices? Well, of course, we tell all these stories, we put women at the center, and we work with this multiplicity of writers. Because only then am I going to see, but this is what the world looks like through my eyes, where I'm living, because I'm younger, because I'm older, because I'm a woman of color, because I'm disabled, because I navigate the world in a power chair and you don't. And it's only through those conversations where you say, brilliant, I didn't know, now I know. Please take this platform and tell the world what it's like from your vantage point. So is it perfect? Of course it's not perfect. Of course it's not perfect, but I work really hard to try and find new writers, to bring in new writers. I work with illustrators as well. People who haven't seen the platform would know that, we have fantastic, essays and journalism, but we also work with a lot of illustrators to create sort of really exquisite artwork that goes with our stories. And those are also voices. And I can even kind of extend the amplification further by saying, if you're an illustrator and you write and you design, work for The Persistent, I want you to be visible too, right? So that means putting their biography there very prominently so that people can find their work and know who they are. And so it really is trying so hard to sort of amplify, not just in the story itself, but in everything we do. I want the writers to be visible. I want the illustrators to be visible. I want us to not be ashamed about kind of showing who we are and what we do.
I like to circle out our conversation by talking about micro skills. These are small, intentional actions or behaviors that people can take when there's an overwhelming goal or task. In this case, centering women and centering the stories and voices of women, no matter what your industry, no matter what your pursuit. So give us 3.
Okay, you gave me a minute to think about it. So I think I'm in the business of storytelling. And we tell stories about women because stories about women aren't that often told, as we've discussed. Or they're told as a sidebar or the second day story or whatever. I tell stories about women exclusively because I am trying to correct a grave imbalance in what is happening around whose stories get told and whose don't. I wish I didn't have to just tell exclusively women's stories. I am interested in everybody's stories. For my first micro skill, I think that we must do a better job of reading women's stories, sharing women's stories. Women's stories aren't just for women. Women's stories are for everyone. I read stories about men as much as I read stories about women. And I think kind of centering those stories in our own lives as if they are just as important as any other story, because they are. Women read books by men and women, and men read books by men. So let's open our minds a little bit and say, I am interested in these stories, and stop discarding them as if they have no value or interest to me. Micro skill number 2 is to, well, I was going to say quote more women, but not everyone is a journalist. But I think maybe the sort of lay person angle on that is to listen quite carefully to what women are saying and hear it and value it and not roll over the top of it. And this is something we see all the time in, meeting culture and things like that, where, women's voices are constantly erased and nobody hears them, and then someone else presents their idea as their own. So I think having your alert up for, did she say something? Did she say something of value that I can help highlight? And I think this is especially pernicious with older women. After sort of age 50 or so, women start to become even more invisible, right? And so they don't get seen, they don't get heard in the same way. So what can we do to lift up older women who might be being steamrolled out of the conversation simply because they're older? Maybe micro skill, they all really connect, but maybe micro skill number 3 is to be a little bit more generous with yourself and with the world and with the people who are navigating through the world, who all have all sorts of difficulties and challenges that are not always visible on the outside. Life is complicated, and I can't say we're all doing our best, but I would like to say that for the most part, most people are really doing the best they can. And I think bringing that generosity and grace to how you perceive the world and how you perceive others and how you interact with others probably make things a lot better for everybody.
So Francesca, as we're rolling out, what should be the title of our episode?
Look, I know you want me to come up with the most zinging and wonderful headline like that, but even as an editor, I put something on the paper and then I change it and then I delete it and then I put something else and then I refine and revise. So there's something about listening, there's something about embracing, there's something about being open-minded, and I think there's something about being quite generous with the people around us. Looking at the world through someone else's eyes can be very, very beneficial because there's so much you don't know yourself. So I suppose something like seeing the world through other eyes, perhaps, is my working title.
Francesca Donner, thank you so much for joining the Visible Voices podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really, really fun.
The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices in the healthcare, equity, and current trend spaces. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Find me at Resa E. Lewis, MD on social media, or visit thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. Find us wherever you listen to podcasts and watch our episodes on YouTube. This podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The views and opinions expressed by our hosts and guests are their own and do not reflect the opinions of their institutions. Information shared here should never substitute for clinical judgment or for medical advice. Together, we're making healthcare more equitable, one visible voice at a time.